So, an inquiry I've gotten a number of times over the past couple of years has come from folks who are curious whether they can easily convert their Jaguar, Mustang, or other short scale Fender to a baritone guitar. And if you've been down that rabbit hole, you've probably found that unfortunately, finding a readily available aftermarket conversion neck for guitars that have that shorter 24-inch scale is basically next to impossible. You're not going to find it, on Reverb or eBay. You're basically going to have to go with a custom maker like Musicraft or Warmouth or Parkland Guitars or something like that, because they're just not available off the shelf, and because of the amount of time that takes, and sometimes the amount of money that such a custom neck might cost, this idea never actually comes to fruition for a lot of folks and ends up being abandoned altogether. Well, a client came to me recently challenging me to transform his Pawn Shop Jaguarillo, which, in case you don't know, is basically just a hot rodded Jaguar, and he wanted to convert this thing to a baritone tuned guitar with thicker baritone type strings without having to swap out the neck. Now, I had a number of reservations about this from the get-go, particularly trying to do such a thing with the stock hardware. Now, just to go over a couple of quick specs about the Jaguarillo, in case you don't know or aren't familiar with the model. This was released a number of years ago by Fender. It had an HSS configuration, which had just a generic humbucker in the bridge and two Strat single coil pickups for the middle and neck pickups. It came with a typical 5-way Strat switching, an adjustomatic or tunematic bridge, as well as a modern placed Jaguar vibrato, which was identical to the ones that they used on the classic player Jaguar, one that I personally am not a fan of because those came with the screw-in tremolo arms, which is not my favorite and just counterintuitive to how a good tremolo arm is supposed to work. And overall, I'm not a huge fan also of the quality of those Korean-made vibrato units specifically for the Jaguar and the Jazzmaster. Also, the nut was going to need to be replaced. It had a Graphtec nut on here, I guess from a previous owner. The slots were already, unfortunately, too worn in to salvage. And so I had to get to the drawing board and try to figure out how we were going to do this thing. So in my initial tests with this guitar, trying to do it with just the stock tremolo, lockdown wasn't really working out too well because I still had a little bit too shallow of a break angle, and that stock tunematic bridge was just a rattly an awful mess. Not a fan. So I started ideating with my client, and thankfully in my parts bin I had unused and brand new one of these Herod hardtail conversion plates that Justin from Herod Pickguards had sent me. If you're not familiar with Herod Pickguards, they make the best, hands down, anodized aluminum pick guards for offsets out there. He makes them for Jazzmaster, Jaguar, basically anything that you can think of. I think Justin can make them for you the same way that Fender used to make them back in the day. But I was shocked and delightfully surprised to see that he was also offering these hardtail conversion plates, which I personally have never tried out on any of my guitars because I obviously really love the tremolo if you've seen any of my other videos. So I was just waiting for the right opportunity to implement this, and this just so happened to be that project. Justin recommends that you use this increased break angle version of the conversion plate on guitars where you are just suffering from a lot of string buzz and you just need that additional string tightness and feel overall. And so I had tried out the normal regular break angle version that he sent to me, and that one unfortunately just didn't have enough string tightness for me, even on these 15 to 65 gauge baritone strings. These are D'Addario chromes. These are thick, fat, heavy strings. Even with those, I was still getting a bit of flop, particularly on the lowest string, which is tuned to B. And so I tried out this increased break angle one, and lo and behold, when paired with one of Mastery's newer version of their Mastery bridge, this was part of their M10.1 kit. If you are looking to convert one of your made in Mexico Jaguars or Jazzmasters or other offset that come with a tune-o-matic or adjust-o-matic bridge, that is the one that you want to get from Mastery, because unlike a lot of other bridge makers out there, Mastery actually does make a proper conversion thimble for adjust-o-matic loaded guitars. And in case you haven't seen or heard about this bridge before, so the new version of the Mastery basically has been almost completely redesigned. It has a new lower profile base to it. You can see there it's got kind of a new shape, and the saddles themselves are recessed into that base. It is a lot lighter than the original Mastery bridge, because the base of this bridge is actually made of like aircraft grade aluminum. And it is noticeably lighter in the hand when you take it out of the packaging, and it doesn't, suffer from any loss of tone in my experience, because the saddles are still the same plated brass saddles that they've been using all along, and I believe that the posts are still the same stainless steel posts that they have been using. So yeah, I really dig it. It almost seems like a more classic look overall to me. Now, the Mastery worked out particularly well in this because it's got the really deep string slots on the saddles, so you aren't going to be getting any, strings jumping out regardless of how hard you're playing. And on top of it, the full contact that the posts make, due to there not being any rocking to this bridge and those posts completely filling up those conversion thimbles, makes it so that the guitar just rings out and sustains really, really beautifully. It's just a super stable bridge, especially for being utilized on this kind of mod. Now, if the idea of removing the tune-o-matic inserts or bushings that come stock on guitars like this is perplexing or daunting to you, don't let it be. It is a super easy process. Basically, all you need to be able to get them out fairly easily, so long as you apply a bit of elbow grease and just take the time and have the patience to do it. You basically just drop a pick guard screw down in the hole, and then you're going to need like an M8 sized bolt, right? And then take a ratchet, or I used this like guitar T-tool. I think that's made by Cruise Tools, right? And so you basically screw that down, and because you left that pickguard screw at the bottom of that hole, the tighter you go down, eventually the bushing in the body or the insert begins to lift up and out of the body. And then the Mastery conversion thimbles are drop-in. I basically just had to lightly hammer them in using my fretting hammer or my rubber mallet, and overall the conversion was pain-free and pretty easy. Now, the last thing that I needed to do to make this conversion work out was to replace the nut. As I had mentioned before, the nut that was already in here was one of those black Graphtec nuts. It had been worn down to the point where it was not salvageable, so I crafted a brand new bone nut for it, shaped and slotted it to depth to accommodate these thick 15 to 65 gauge strings, and it worked out overall really well. And just, I prefer bone to Graphtec personally, on my own personal guitars. That said, Graphtec, New Bone, whatever, it's definitely a good and very consistent nut material, and I wouldn't have had to replace it if the slots weren't too deep. So yeah, with all of that done, the last was to dial in the setup. So originally I had dropped in a shim, one of Curtis Novak's reproduction fiberboard shims that he sells in a pack of 3 on his website. Those, when I have them available, are my shims of choice. Otherwise, I'll just use cardstock. But I did have a number of them still. They're about 0.75 millimeters in thickness, and that resulted in the bridge sitting a bit too high. If you notice now, the bridge is sitting a lot lower, which is what I wanted on this, because we've got, again, really thick strings and wanted to have the ability to still bend. And when I had that shim in place, unfortunately, what ended up happening was that the bridge had to sit too high. It was something like 4 or 5 millimeters away from the pick guard. That's the bottom of the bridge. And these strings just felt really, really tight, even in this B2B tuning. And so that gives us the ability to adjust if needed. If my client finds that he wants the strings even tighter than they are now, we can just add shim, maybe not that full, 0.75 millimeter shim, but maybe a 0.5 to start with. We can try and we can dial it in because we have space. We can raise this bridge, 5 millimeters if we need to, maybe even a little bit higher. I don't like to go over 4 typically, but again, it's a case by case scenario and depends on the needs of the guitar. Any more than that though, typically I get a little bit worried about strings breaking, or the tightness of the strings ends up being so high that you end up getting unwanted vibrations and things like that. So yeah, I thought that this was a good happy medium, and I'm happy to report that with everything else in place, with the mastery, with the new nut, that this just feels awesome. Let's go ahead and plug it in just so you all can hear. This thing just sounds nice and bassy and deep and so different from a typical guitar. Now, it's not quite bass 6 territory, but it starts to get you into the ballpark. Now, if you're not familiar with bass 6s, those are essentially bass guitars, short scale, and they are typically tuned E to E. And so this one here is tuned a bit lower, B to B. So that is one difference. That, and also people typically go with even thicker strings on the bass 6 because it is supposed to be, or is, an actual 6-string bass. But yeah, I am really happy with how this came out with its current setup. I'm happy to report that the strings are nice and taut. I'm not really getting any buzzing on here, which is really great all the way up the neck, thanks to the fretwork that was done on here. But we do still have the ability to bend, within reason. It's not going to be easy. You're going to have to give it a little bit of strength, work out those fingers a bit, but it can be done, definitely a lot more so now that I had removed that shim that I originally put in there. And it just plays like a dream. Just the deeper tones that you get from a baritone, I think, inspire you to play differently, to write differently. And so I can understand why my client wanted to do this kind of mod and configuration on this guitar, especially because he now also has a Fender Jaguar as well that I think he keeps in more of a standard configuration. So it's cool when you have a bunch of guitars to have a couple of them set up to alternate tunings or just alternate configurations that you wouldn't otherwise have the ability to if you only had one or two guitars. If you are interested in doing these mods to your Jaguar yourself, the costs overall weren't too bad. The conversion plate itself was not very expensive. It was only about 40 bucks. Now, the Mastery M10.1 kit, that's the one that comes with the actual conversion thimbles for Tune-o-matic or Adjust-o-matic loaded offsets, comes to about 250 US dollars. Now, I know that is a pretty penny to pay and quite expensive for a bridge, but you definitely get your quality's worth from that price. I cannot recommend a better bridge for this application than this, only because the Mastery is very unique in the fact that it has the deepest saddle slots of any of the offset bridges that I have tried. And that is definitely beneficial for these thicker gauge strings here. Secondly, the fact that it doesn't rock, right? That having that extra sustain on tap in conjunction with the hardtail conversion plate just makes for a really overall stable experience. The strings like ring out really clean. And so, yeah, I really dig the Mastery for this. Now, that's not to say that other bridges might not work, but I feel like the Mastery does give you the most comparable to a hardtail feel overall. So your mileage may vary if you try doing this with a different bridge. Now, the last thing that you are going to need is a new nut. Now, if you have professional nut slotting files at home and it isn't your first rodeo working on guitars, a brand new nut is basically dirt cheap. You can get bone nut blanks for as cheap as like, I don't know, like $3. If you buy in bulk, you can get pre-sawed nuts for fairly affordable too, anywhere from Amazon to eBay and Reverb. I usually see those pre-slotted bone nuts starting around $7-8 or so. If you have to pay a luthier, expect to probably pay at least $100, if not a little bit more, to get a new nut crafted and slotted for you for the particular string gauge that you are trying to use. So overall, the amount of actual mods that went into this thing is about probably $400 worth, and that includes the service of me making the new nut for my client. Now, whether this will work on a traditional Jaguar, one where the vibrato is placed further back away, I cannot speak to because I haven't tried it on a normal Jaguar. That could potentially be a video for the future if another client comes to me wanting to try to do that kind of thing. I imagine that there would be a couple of problems because of the fact that that further vibrato placement would result in an overall less steep break angle, which is necessary. That's kind of what makes this work. We already have the steeper break angle because the vibrato has been moved up on this particular model, right? And we're also using the conversion plate that has an even more increased break angle. So it's a twofold solution that is happening here. So if you are just trying to use like the stock tremolo, for example, maybe try to lock that down, or if you try to calibrate even a stock tremolo that is in that vintage placement, I do not know how well that's going to work because firstly, the spring itself might not be strong enough or have enough tension to accommodate strings this thick. You might have to go out and find one that has more tension. I feel like you could also try just locking it down by getting rid of the spring altogether if you don't want to get a conversion plate. But again, the more break angle that you can get right? The better if you are trying to do this kind of mod. And the advantage of using a hardtail conversion plate is that the strings, the balls of the strings are actually sitting inside of the body at this point. And that's not something that you are going to get with just a traditional vibrato configuration. Now, this is just a theory, obviously, but you might be able to mitigate those issues by going with an even thicker gauge of strings. Again, this is a 15 to 65 set of flat wounds. Flat wounds end up helping minimize common issues like fret buzz and things like that. So it was a really, really good choice for this mod here, but your mileage may vary depending on what kind of strings you use and what thickness or gauge they are. But definitely would be curious to hear from you all if you do decide to experiment. I also could see this mod working just fine, obviously, on a Jazzmaster that is similarly set up. So Jazzmasters like your classic players or the Player 2s that came out recently that also have the moved up vibrato systems. The J Mascis, Squire Jazzmaster, or even the Ventera 60s modified Jaguars and Jazzmasters. I could see this mod working out really well, again, because those vibratos are moved up closer. And so you are going to be implementing a very similar recipe to what I used here. Overall, I am super happy with the way that this turned out. I just really, really love the baritone configuration. These thicker strings just give you such a different tone, and it's inspiring to play and write in a different way on this kind of instrument. I feel like this is something that folks who have been curious about maybe getting themselves a bass six want to get that different kind of flavor, maybe out of a spare guitar that they have that's been kind of being unused, would be the perfect way to kind of reintroduce it into your your rotation overall. Breathe new life into it, so to speak. Because yeah, it's just really, really fun to play. And as you heard from the demos today, having a baritone in your arsenal makes for some really unique tones that you're not going to be getting otherwise. Just these really deep, lush, sometimes even haunting kind of tones that you aren't going to be getting from a standard tuned guitar. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, especially if you've been curious about potentially converting your Jaguar or Jazzmaster to a baritone. I hope that my findings were helpful and inspire you to potentially take the leap and try these mods on your own guitar. If you haven't already, please hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell to be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. And don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars modding tips.